Hello, I'm Phil Dobby, and this week on Balls Radio, we look at this year's last week of Parliament. What a disgrace that was. And we ask, if you're the opposition and you're going to put someone out there to attack the Prime Minister for having a murky past, allegedly, then is Julie Bishop the right person to choose, given her past, allegedly?
It's also very strange to have someone with perhaps not a spotless record making allegations of dishonesty against the Prime Minister.
Yes, we'll be drawing conclusions from a series of non-proven allegations later on. Well, not conclusions, really. We'll just be pulling the allegations together so you can be the judge yourself. I know it's a pretty despicable tactic, but pretty much what the opposition has been doing, and using Parliament to do it, with a little help, of course, from the media.
Politics today has become a 24-hour media game. Let's see who can win the headlines.
That's former Liberal Leader John Hewson, of course, a man who took his fair share of slating from Paul Keating when Keating was the Prime Minister and Hewson was the opposition leader. We'll see what he thinks of the way the Parliament is behaving lately. And we'll also hear from Ross Bowler, a barrister in Brisbane who's been digging into Julie Bishop's past. That should all make for an entertaining half hour.
Balls Radio with Phil Dobby. What's really going on?
Well, last week was a disgraceful week in politics, wasn't it, really? The entire week spent debating the Prime Minister's past and how involved she was in setting up a slush fund from which funds were misappropriated, even though nobody's been able to nail her for benefiting from those proceeds herself. But the least we can say is that she chose her boyfriend very badly. But everyone can make a mistake on who they hang out with, and we'll have more on that in a moment. But first, let's go back 10 years. Dr. John Hewson was the opposition leader in the federal parliament. He was pushing his Fight Back programme, which basically was the first go at trying to introduce the GST into the country. And it wasn't popular in the opinion polls. And the first whiff of the programme being revised in any way, and Prime Minister Keating was onto him.
But he said, we are going to change tack. No, he didn't change tack, he just pulled the sail down. Pulled the sail right down. Mr. Speaker, in the great contest of ideas in the Australian political system, Dr. Hewson a week ago retired hurt. Retired hurt. The instant change, we saw the instant change from warrior to wimp.
From warrior to wimp, Keating was, of course, the master of the put down. John Howard, he called famously the desiccated coconut, saying he is the greatest job and investment destroyer since the bubonic plague. Andrew Peacock, an intellectual rust bucket. John Hewson again saying an attack by him in Parliament is like being flogged with a warm lettuce. Certainly the master of the put down, wasn't he? We'll speak to John Hewson, the man at the receiving end of some of that Keating rhetoric, fairly soon. First, though, let's move forward to just a year ago in Parliament.
In the words of Oliver Cromwell, 359 years ago, which apply as much to this government today as they then did, you have sat here too long for any good you have been doing. Depart and let us have done with you. In the name of God, go. And that is what the Australian people want this government to do.
Yeah, Christopher Pyne, bless his little cotton socks, trying unsuccessfully for a censor motion that the government is incompetent and should stand down. But he really needs to work on his put-downs, doesn't he, if he's going to reach Paul Keating's standards, I think. But that's where Parliament was a year ago, and it hasn't moved on. In fact, it's got worse. We'll look at some of the specifics of the AWU affair shortly, and the slush fund that Julia Gillard helped to set up. But we'll talk to a lawyer about it. Imagine that, bringing in the law into allegations of fraud and embezzlement. But first, though, I mean, let's just look at the way Parliament is behaving. John Hewson is a former Liberal leader. We've got him on the phone. John Hewson, I mean, it really has reached a pretty low ebb, hasn't it?
Yeah, look, it's a race to the bottom in terms of character assassination. I mean, it started with a vengeance from about the middle of the year, where the government took the view that once the carbon tax was in place, that they'd turn the heat up on Abbott. So they had the attack dogs out on him on a pretty sustained basis, particularly three women attack dogs, and tagged him as a misogynist and went after him on several fronts. The opposition recently returned the favour to Gillard by linking her with the AWU scandal, and but it is a race to the bottom. It's got nothing to do with policy. It's all about character assassination, really.
And it's amazing how people get away with this. I mean, Tony Abbott has repeatedly said of Julia Gillard in the press and on TV that it's not a question of whether she was an untrustworthy lawyer. We're going to talk about that incessantly, but it's not a question of that. It's that she's an untrustworthy head of government. Now, I mean, even that, if I was to say, and I know you can say certain things in Parliament, if I was to say, look, John, you're an untrustworthy company director, and I kept on saying it, I mean, that's defamatory in our everyday lives, but because of parliamentary privilege, it seems to be the main game now.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think they would confine themselves to Parliament. They just run flat out wherever they are, on whatever occasion they find themselves. But look, I think the bottom line is the electorate don't like it because both of them have a dissatisfaction rating consistently above 50%. The electorate doesn't like either of them, didn't like them at the time of the election, didn't particularly like the way either of them became leader, didn't like their lack of policies and the nature of their campaigns, and hasn't really liked them since. So, I think they're just in worse shape today than they were when they started in the eyes of the electorate, because I think the electorate is tiring of all this name calling and personal attack, and more interested in trying to see some of the problems solved in good government. And
yet the whole thing looks, on both sides, I guess, it looks as though it has been stage managed. I mean, you look at who's saying what and when. I mean, this is not people firing off the handle at random. This has been carefully worked out.
It has. I mean, you saw the same in the US election. I mean, with Obama and Romney. I mean, Obama started his campaign by a vicious personal attack on Romney in the 10 key battleground seats. I mean, saturation media about how the guy, was wealthy, couldn't relate to the average person, didn't pay enough tax, that sort of thing, didn't have any policies, whatever it was. But he did such a damage to Romney that Romney could never have recovered during the course of the campaign. And Romney started to return the favour on Obama, and again, both of them had personal dissatisfaction ratings of about 50%. So, I think they're all missing the point that while the game of politics is scoring points on a daily basis, captures their entire imagination, and the electorate's sick of it.
Yeah, I'm wondering what they're thinking the end game is, actually. I mean, what was the Liberal Party trying to do? Were they trying to get the Prime Minister to resign? I mean, it seems like to go on such a major attack so far out from the next election.
Well, they started from the last election. I mean, they started with the fact that she said there'd be no carbon tax under a government I lead. She can't be trusted. She can't. She doesn't tell the truth, whatever the way they put it. And they've just built on that theme, and she's counter punched, if you like, with Abbott by focusing on his poor standing with women in particular, and the fact that he doesn't have any policies. But the irony is that both of them now have got uncosted policies that go well over $100 billion. Both support a national disability scheme, a Gonski education revolution, a national dental scheme, some sort of national broadband network, one form or another. None of these are funded, let alone any of their other commitments. So, they're just getting away with, making promises against which they'll never deliver, and at the same time focusing on personal attacks, sort of the 24-hour media cycle. Character assassination. So
is the media complicit in all of this? I mean, on two levels, I guess. On the one level, that they're reporting all this sort of stuff. I mean, if they just didn't, it probably wouldn't happen. But secondly, not questioning the real stuff, which, as you say, is how many of these policies are costed? Are they really going to work? How are you prioritising? I mean, those are questions that aren't getting asked.
No, and look, the media has become part of the game in a way. Some of the media see themselves as players in that game these days. I mean, I remember back at the time that Rudd was elected, for the first time I could remember, as senior journalists were coming out taking positions on who ought to win, which, hadn't happened before. I just think the standard of journalism has been eroded in the process. They are part of the game. They don't see any merit. You look at the election campaign, there's a so-called policy announced per day. It lasts a day. It gets very little scrutiny. Next day, another statement somewhere else about something else. So in the end, there's no real policy. I mean, policy's a little better than dot points or sound bites these days. Anything you can get away with: stop the boats, reduce the debt, achieve a budget surplus. I mean, these are not policies. They don't tell you how and how it's going to be paid for and so on, as you're saying it. They're just statements of intent, perhaps.
That's right. And what about reducing? Whenever I hear the debt question, what about private debt, which I think people in the media are completely oblivious to. But I mean, is this a fault? The fact that all of this is happening now, why is this so elevated all over the world? I mean, the changing factor has to be that there's more media, there's more competition in the media space. So they're going down the lowest common denominator. Is that what's changed, or has the very basis of Parliament changed? What's driving this race to the bottom?
Well, there are a number of factors. I mean, clearly the media is part of it, and the politics today has become a 24-hour media game. Let's see who can win the headlines, on the evening news, or dominate the headlines, the front page the next day type of thing. And any day can be another issue, so there's no detailed, sustained debate on anything. But I think that politicians are gun shy. I mean, nobody wants to lead on these issues because they all adopt a small target strategy. Ever since I attempted to lay out a detailed policy position on every policy in '93, which people now list as the longest political suicide note in history, they've all.
You were giving us policies. You were giving us policies. That was your mistake. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. And they don't want to be big targets. They don't want to attract any attention. They just want this sort of superficial, oh, he was clever today. That was a clever line. He really put her in a box, or she really put him in his box, sort of thing. And and the next day is another opportunity to do just that. And the bottom line is, it is a race to the bottom where the standards are being eroded, where policies are not being debated or presented or debated, and where there's very little government. I mean, the processes of government are just appalling, and decisions are not getting taken. So we're seeing our infrastructure erode. I mean, in New South Wales, transport, hospitals, schools, ports, it doesn't matter what it is. You can point your finger and say, gosh, they should have done that 10 or 15 years ago. And, of course, it has never been done as the game has got worse. And it's not likely to be done. I mean, nobody wants to actually lead and sort of build a proper new highway.
So do we need to change?
I have the argument about it. So we're not getting government, and the problems are not being solved. And I think the electorate is increasingly getting pretty disenchanted by all this.
So doesn't that mean that the rules of the game needs to change? We somehow need to change. I mean, we keep on talking about what a marvellous, how the Westminster system is serving us well. Perhaps it's not. Perhaps our system of government needs to change.
I think it's more abuse of the system, really. I mean, what we need is leadership. We need somebody who's prepared to stand up and say, look, I'm not going to play this game anymore. I mean, this point scoring is stupid. It's a little better than university politics, I'm going to take a mature approach to government. I'm going to argue on the issues and, okay, slam me, but I'm going to focus on governing this country and doing a few things right. And, you need that sort of leadership, but you don't see it. You saw no leadership in the US election, for example. I mean, they managed to get through 3 debates without doing any detailed policy. I couldn't believe they never discussed the elephant in the room, the fiscal cliff, which, automatically cuts the budget deficit to half from over $1 trillion to about $530 million overnight on December 31. It's in legislation. 3 to 4% off the growth rate in the US, and it never got mentioned in the campaign, yet the day after the campaign, the whole focus is, well, what are you going to do about the fiscal cliff? You would have thought they might have debated that in the course of the campaign.
You would have thought so.
And both sides now are chasing a budget surplus. You've got the Reserve Bank in Australia trying to ease the situation, trying to stimulate a little bit by cutting interest rates, although they're about twice as high as they should be. They are bringing them down. At the same time, the government and the opposition are arguing for competing on who's going to have the biggest budget surplus. So, they're contracting the economy while the Reserve Bank's trying to expand it. The whole policy scene is a mess. And there's no sensible debate about that.
So, and are we ever going to get that? I mean, that's why I'm questioning whether something needs to change somewhere along the lines. Because, I mean, even things like...
You're either going to get leadership or a crisis, I think, to change it. A real crisis which, the government finds itself at the back to the wall and it has to solve a couple of problems and it has to get on and do it. Or, somebody's prepared to stand up and say, I'm not playing this 24-hour media game anymore, and I challenge the media to support good government rather than good point scoring.
All right. Well, John, I've enjoyed talking to you again. Look, I do think there's going to be some people looking and going, oh, look, there's John Hewson talking about the need for policies. He tried to introduce policies. Look what happened to him. You're not a great case study.
No, that's right.
Good to talk. Thanks for your time.
Thanks, mate. Bye.
There we are. That's former Liberal Leader John Hewson, of course, here on Balls Radio.
Balls Radio with Phil Dobby.
So just to get some context, let's just have a quick look at exactly what's been happening over the last few months over this AWU scandal. Supposedly, Julia Gillard helped to set up a slush fund for the Australian Workplace Reform Association. That fund was used to siphon off money. Julia Gillard, of course, has never been implicated in that, and the opposition has been trying hard to find something, in fact, anything to lay on the Prime Minister.
Will the Prime Minister confirm that as a partner of Slater and Gordon, she wrote to the Commissioner in 1992 vouching that the association complied with the legal requirements of the Associations Incorporation Act, even though she knew it did not?
And she didn't answer that question directly, of course. All she said was, it's all been said before.
The claim that the Deputy Leader of the Opposition has now made is a claim that appeared in The Age. I think the journalist's name is Mark Baker, who made that claim. The correspondence he refers to has never been produced, so the claim has been made, but no correspondence has ever been produced.
But the transcript of her exit interview from Slater and Gordon has, and Nick Stein-Brown, who was a partner in the firm at the time, has released details of it. Strange how he carries around exit interviews from previous places he's worked, claiming Julia Gillard did write to the WA Corporate Affairs Commission to say the Australian Workplace Reform Association wasn't a trade union body, which is fair enough, because it wasn't. So at worst, the Prime Minister is guilty of writing a truthful letter to help set up an association that went on to have some money pilfered out of it by the Prime Minister's badly selected boyfriend, who she dumped. Now, to some people, it might all sound a bit dodgy, but what's she really done wrong here? Is it enough to warrant a week of parliamentary time spent on it? And if she's not answering questions directly, well, look, we're going to get a lawyer's view about how you should answer questions in a courtroom, even if you're innocent. More on that in a moment. First of all, let's look at all of this from a slightly different tack. I want to suggest that race mixing is a very bad thing. I mean, it led to the destruction of ancient Greece. And clearly, some races are obviously superior to others. White Australia has now been replaced by the Yellow Australia policy, a policy more racist than the White Australia policy ever was. It's Anglicide. I also want to suggest that citizens need guns. No regular army can defend Australia as effectively as determined patriots familiar with and well supplied with small arms. I know what you're thinking. Has he lost his mind? No, all of these words are lifted from the website of the Australian League of Rights, an organisation that back in 1994 was given some support by Ross Lightfoot, who spoke favourably for them in Parliament. He was, at the time, a West Australian Liberal senator. This is the same Ross Lightfoot who hasn't had too many good words to say about the Aboriginal population of Australia. He said, as a civilised nation, I do not know whether we could accept Aboriginal culture. I hold no guilt for what happened to the Aboriginal people, and black children can have no guilt for what happened to the early white settlers who were killed or mutilated. Well, at least, here's a man who's not trying too hard to be politically correct, is he? But you'd have to say his views are a little out of kilter with most right-minded people. At least you'd hope so. No surprise, then, that he gave his preferences to Pauline Hanson. He's the guy who, you might remember, elbowed Bob Brown out of the way on the floor of the Senate, you might remember, when the Green senator was trying to get to the visiting President George W. Bush to hand him a letter from the wife of Mandu Habib. And this is the same Ross Lightfoot who allegedly, back in 2005, smuggled $20,000 into Iraq on behalf of Woodside Petroleum to give to the Kurdish government in the north of the country. Now, he denied that. He demanded News Limited retract the allegations. They didn't retract those allegations, but they did publish a photograph of the senator in Iraq brandishing an AK-47. A colourful character, that's for sure. Sadly, Ross Lightfoot has retired from politics, but on the face of it, is he the sort of man you'd like your daughter to be dating? I'd have thought not, wouldn't you? So Mr. and Mrs. Bishop must have been rather distraught when their daughter, recently divorced, started dating such a man with such extreme views. It seems she now has something in common with the Prime Minister, doesn't she? They didn't pick their boyfriends too well. And then sometime after that, she married Perth Lord Mayor Peter Nattrass. who had a rough time of it when he revealed the criminal records of a fellow councillor, Terry Mauler or Maller. People wanted to know how he came across those records. What contacts did he use? Was his wife involved? Now, I haven't a shred of evidence to suggest that she was, but, you know, she's a former lawyer in that town. She's bound to have contacts. If you want to get hold of criminal records, maybe she could help. I'm not saying she did. I'm just speculating. Maybe we need to get her to deny it. Deny these allegations. See how easy it is to do this? So you can see what a shady past she has, or at least what shady company she has kept, or perhaps allegedly shady company. Now, I don't want to say that she is shady because, well, you know, that would be defamatory. Plus, I don't necessarily believe it, but it does show if you put 2 and 2 together, you can get 6. And but wait, there is more. There's more on Julie Bishop. Let's leave some of it, though, to Ross Bowler. He's a barrister in Brisbane. Love the alliteration. Barrister in Brisbane. He specialises in criminal law. He's thrown himself into the social media debate about the accusations against the Prime Minister over the last few weeks, a subject that obviously has completely monopolised Parliament last week. So you've been digging the dirt too. So tell me, what have you found? Let's start with asbestos.
Well, hello. How are you?
I'm good.
Digging the dirt.
Digging the dirt and finding asbestos.
I prefer to say I've been doing some research, occupational hazard.
Right. Well, you're a lawyer and I'm a media person. So, but our language we'll find a happy medium.
Okay.
So tell me about the asbestos.
Well, the asbestos litigation, people were, they say, harmed by their employer. They brought an action in the court. Julia Bishop was engaged, as I understand it, as a solicitor by CSR, and I think also the relevant state government insurance office to defend. And in the abstract, that's fine. But sometimes lawyers get criticised for the way they prosecute their particular cases. And Julia Bishop has been the subject of some criticism in the way she went about defending her client's position.
So it's implied, although never proven, that she was using legal tactics to try and delay the day in court for those asbestos claimants.
Yeah, use procedural tactics to deny victims of asbestos, asbestosis, I should say, their day in court.
Right. Okay, and the intention behind that would presumably be that I mean, it's awful to say this, but you know, if you're thinking from the side of the company, you'd be thinking, well, some of these people are going to die before they reach court. We're not going to have to pay as much.
Yes, and on one view, perhaps that's acceptable in terms of money, but from a moral view, people are saying that's reprehensible.
I love it when a lawyer starts talking about morals. It gives me hope in mankind. But let's look elsewhere. You found examples of plagiarism.
Well, a cut and paste job was suggested. There was an essay, and Julie Bishop, well, allegations were made that she plagiarised her part. Her staff copied from a Wall Street Journal article and put it into a speech she delivered in Parliament. Now, all I'm saying is this. If you're going to prosecute someone for bad behaviour, and that seems to be what role Julie Bishop was playing against the Prime Minister, it's interesting that you would choose someone, as you have said, with an asbestos defence background and also having had this plagiarism allegation in 2008, because it suggests the focus might not necessarily be continually on the Prime Minister, but the person making the allegations. And it's also very strange to have someone with perhaps not a spotless record making allegations of dishonesty against the Prime Minister.
Now that's an interesting word. Perhaps there's a lawyer speaking that's for sure, because we don't know, of course, whether any of these allegations can be laid back to her. But I mean, and there's other examples as well. But I think what we're saying is that if you go into people's history, sometimes you're going to find things where there's a bit of smoke, and we have this belief if there's a bit of smoke, then there must be fire, which isn't necessarily true, of course.
Well,
sometimes there's not a shred of evidence.
I'm not suggesting anything's proven. I'm saying it's an unusual choice of putting someone out the front because the focus can be on her. As a defence lawyer, what we would do, I suspect, is say, how can you believe the prosecutor when you've got, or the prosecution witness when you've got all these suspicions or all these questions about their reliability?
And look, and we could go further on all of this, couldn't we? I mean, there's further claims of plagiarism. I mean, we can stack up circumstantial evidence here.
Well, 2008, September was a plagiarism allegation. After that, 2008, there was an allegation of changing Hansard. Subsequently, there was an allegation in 2008 of Julia Bishop again being involved in plagiarism. Now, I repeat, allegations, right? Allegations.
Of course.
Not saying anything.
No. She
did it, just allegations.
Yeah. The same as the allegations against the Prime Minister.
Yes, and if you're going to robustly question the Prime Minister, it's hard to understand why you would have put Julia Bishop at the front to take
yeah, exactly.
the focus away.
Yeah. So, I mean, we've just shown, haven't we? I mean, it's almost a character assassination just from stuff we've seen on the internet. I mean, none of this is proven. This is all just piecing together a piece of history to try and paint a character of a person. And I think that's what's really being done in Parliament, isn't it, with the Prime Minister?
Look, ask anyone in the street whether they want to be the subject of the smear campaign, whether they want to be told that there's something that they've done wrong, but they're not going to be told the full details of it. Well, that's not our system of justice. Our system of justice is the Crown makes the allegation, the accused is presumed innocent, and the Crown has to prove it beyond a reasonable doubt. And as a defence tactic, what some lawyers do is attack the prosecution and reduce its credibility. And if you ask the questions in the abstract, for example, is it unlawful to provide false information to an electoral commission? Mr. Abbott would say yes. Is that something that should warrant a full judicial inquiry? As I understand it, Mr. Abbott would say yes. Well, what about someone who's alleged to have provided false information to the Australian Electoral Commission? Would that be prima facie unlawful? Paraphrasing, I assume he would say yes. And what about that person? Is that someone who should be on the receiving end of a full judicial inquiry? Perhaps he would say yes. Well then, that might make life uncomfortable for him because that's an allegation that some people want to make.
Balls Radio.
Yes, it does seem that you can make all sorts of allegations in Parliament in all directions, and then when you throw on the media spotlight, anyone can appear as guilty as hell. Politics certainly is a dirty job, isn't it? Some interesting thoughts from Ross Bowler, our barrister in Brisbane, and also thanks to John Hewson for coming on the programme. And hopefully, in the last half hour, we've shown that if you want to muckrake, you can muckrake. And we've done some. On Julie Bishop. Now, these were all allegations. Nothing's been proven. I'm sure in reality she's all sweetness and light, as innocent as the early morning dewdrops. Although, you know, I'd have to say I'd never take a job defending a company against asbestos claimants. But that's a value call, isn't it? And I'm sure she felt she was doing the right thing. And some of the boys she hung out with, you know, well, we all make mistakes in our lives, don't we? But interrogating the Prime Minister in Parliament, look, if you're going to do that, you really do need to be prepared to take a taste of your own medicine, don't you? Unless, of course, you'd rather just get on with life, use Parliament for what Parliament is intended, and talk about policy. I mean, who knows? The Australian public might even respect you for it. Respect! Can you imagine that for politicians? I know it's a big ask, but it's worth a shot, surely. And that's Balls Radio for this week. I'm Phil Dobbie. I'll see you next time.